Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the JPU Show. I'm one of your co-hosts and the co-founder of the Jax Podcasters United Group. My name is Badr Milligan, and I've got my right-hand woman and the big brain, Blythe Brumley.
Hello,
what up,
hello.
Blythe? How you doing?
Oh, I was a little early with the hello.
Yeah,
Sorry.
a little early with it. Okay. I mean, we've been recording all day, so I know you're getting back. You're getting into the swing of things. You're getting that momentum built, which will be helpful because you're leading the topic of this video. We're taking a look at the podcast landscape 2024 report. I guess you didn't get enough podcast reporting from the last video we did, and you found another very long, detailed report, but one that I will admit, I think I like this report slightly better than the other one. I guess it's hard for me to say I like this one because did I read the whole thing? Not yet. Did I find an article that gave me the 5 big takeaways? Absolutely. That was a very quick read. Now, we will have links to the podcast landscape report in the show notes, so you could download that, read along, as well as the article I just mentioned. But this is where I step away from the mic and I let our big brain co-host handle the rest. We're going to talk about some of the key findings, things that stick out to us, and maybe anything that might be helpful for podcasters. Take it away, Bud.
So this 2024 edition of the podcast landscape, it comes from Sounds Profitable. So they have a very good newsletter. If you think it's Pod News is the other one that's like a daily newsletter. Sounds Profitable, I think, sends 3 emails a week. They might send more than that, but I'm not 100% sure. But they just released this study and they surveyed a little over 5,000 Americans 18 and older, making it the largest publicly available study of podcasting in the country. So before we get into some of the findings, we kind of talked on the last episode about this report that had come out. I think it was an advertising study, and you couldn't really find how they came to those results. What was the methodology behind that study? And I just want to point this out really quick because you have to, when you see reports like this, when you see studies like this, or you hear like, oh, this percentage, I don't know, podcasters have grown, 50% in the last 2 years. And it's like, well, what is that data comparing it to? How can you have that, where are those numbers coming from? And so it's really good that this study actually list a lot of their methodology out. And so they surveyed a little over 5,000 people, 5,071 to be exact. They also list in the bottom of sort of the download page of where you download the study. That the study also contains invaluable information about the reasons for churn and ways to improve conversion from podcasting trial to regular usage. Very like standard boilerplate terminology. But then they say the study was conducted in partnership with Signal Hill Insights and is made possible through the cooperation of Wondery, American Public Media, ESPN Podcast, BetterHelp, SiriusXM Podcast Network, Libsyn Ads, Paramount, and NPR. Very famous.
I'm still scrolling our partners list. I mean, they've got It Sounds Profitable has a lot of partners and sponsors I've never even heard of.
Yeah. And so when I'm naming off those companies, obviously these are big companies, and obviously the people that they know. And this sort of goes to my point of like how to read a study like this. So when you see where typically when you run a study, you partner with a company that is that typically does studies like this. They survey people, you give them a user base, an email list. They reach out regularly. Sometimes they offer, gift cards in order to complete a study, perks, anything like that. Very rarely do they say, just please fill out this study, because they know people very rarely are going to fill that kind of information out. So that's something you want to keep in mind. The next thing you want to keep in mind is what is their user base? So when you think of like ESPN Podcast, BetterHelp, SiriusXM Podcast Network, Libsyn Ads, Paramount, NPR, these are major companies that have major funding. Their audience of podcasters or their podcast listenership is, I think, a little different than, say, independent podcasters. Would you agree?
Ask that one more time.
So
I'm sorry. I clicked on one of the partners, a lawyer for podcasters, and I was scrolling through their website. I am
not even listening.
I apologize.
What the hell? Well, my point is that with these companies, with the exception of Libsyn Ads, The rest of these companies are all very large podcasting companies. Not exactly sure if some of them are even profitable. ESPN podcasts, definitely Wondery, who has run into some issues before with funding. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about, okay, well, who is this audience of 5,000 listeners that they are surveying? Are they podcast listeners or are they Sirius XM listeners? And so you just keeping that in mind, keeping that up top of mind. You want to look at this because you want to see if they possibly have any kind of biases. So we kind of listed those out with, they are bigger companies. They're not necessarily, and I don't know that I think Alex Flippo, with Pod Pros, is that his business? Pod Pros? He has started doing independent podcaster studies. I don't know of really anyone else that is doing independent podcaster studies. So knowing that this is the sample pool, you want to ask yourself, like, what percentage of the sample size consists of the entire ecosystem? How many podcasters actively listen to a show at least once a week? We don't really know. We can only go off of surveys like this. You also want to look for what is the sample size of that survey relative to the entire population. 5,000 podcast listeners relative to the entire population that's listening. So you can kind of take these results with a grain of salt. With all of that said, just trying to teach people on how to read studies like this and either take it with a grain of salt or take it very seriously. But also take note of the landscape, that these kind of podcast surveys don't really exist. And so this is kind of the data that we're working with. And so this is the data that we are going to go off of. They did list some really major trends, and I thought that we could kind of go through some of those. Basically, do you want me to screen share and kind of go through some of these findings and like next steps?
Yeah, let's screen share. Let's get the folks some visuals.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull up this study. And like I said, we will list the link to download this report in the show notes, but you can also just Google search it, the podcast landscape 2024. It will show up. While
you're pulling that up, I want to say that I thought it was reassuring to know that they had an exact number of people that they interviewed, that they had the demographic breakdown, like, who they are, cultural background, age. I think, they made a point of it, like, hey, this is 18 plus, it was 18 plus on up, all Americans. So, like being able to identify exactly that sample pool, to your point, I think gives a lot of reassurance and confidence in the report, where it's like, okay, well, in the grand scheme of things, 5,071 people is a small sample size in the grand scheme of things, but better than nothing.
Yeah, we don't have much to work off of because a lot of the companies haven't done this kind of research yet, or this just asking these kinds of questions. Number one, surveying is incredibly challenging. It's incredibly difficult. And then you have these major companies like YouTube and Spotify and Apple. They're not sharing data with each other. They're isolated in their own little bubbles. And so you kind of have to make you have to infer where maybe trends are going, where the market is shifting. And one of those things that I think is having a profound impact on podcasting is YouTube. Yeah. I personally have moved, I would say 70% of my podcast consumption to YouTube. There are the shows that I listen to, and if I know that you have a YouTube version of your podcast, I'm going to watch it on YouTube. That's frankly where I spend a good majority of my time enjoying content, even if it's just two talking heads. And so this finding from one of their findings and action steps is how they kind of list them. And they have about a half a dozen of these findings and action steps. And one of the first ones that really caught my eye is they say YouTube has solidified and even expanded its importance as a platform for podcasting, particularly for discovery. It says and one of the action steps is your podcast may not belong on YouTube, but you do in some shape or form. And so their advice to you is you need to get your ass on YouTube for discoverability. We talked about in a previous episode about, Apple and what sort of their next, how they've kind of been a little bit asleep at the wheel and what does their next steps look like. I'm sure that they've heard this argument about discoverability before. So we might be getting, one of those episode or podcast algorithms coming from Apple, which is frankly, they should have done it a long time ago. I'm thankful for feeds that don't have an algorithm because I can choose. But then there's also the downside of it affects discoverability, and you kind of get in your own bubble of the things that you're used to listening to and used to digesting. But what do you think about this finding, especially when it comes to YouTube?
That was one of the points that I had noted here, is that according to the report, they're saying 53% of Americans 18 plus now say they consumed, and I want to emphasize that, consumed an audio or video podcast in the last 30 days.
Sorry to correct you.
Okay, 52, I had 53, 52%, sorry, have consumed an audio or video podcast in the last 30 days, not listened to, but consumed. Meaning that, they're listening and watching, and however else, I guess, encompasses consume. I think those are probably the two right there. But to your point, it emphasizes that audio and video podcast, whether it be audio or a video podcast, are starting to become, one and the same thing. I think it's getting harder and harder to separate. When you say podcast, well, I think the trend now is, is it on YouTube? Where are you at on YouTube? It's not completely and only associated with an audio format. So I did want to emphasize that more than half of the sample size, which would be 2,500 plus people that they interviewed, are consuming their podcast in audio and video format.
And I think I might have been reading off a different stat because it says YouTube is named as a source for podcast discovery by 52% of podcast consumers, second only to recommendations, which is 56%. Yep. So 56% of people are finding out about a new podcast based on a personal recommendation. Second, 52% are finding out through YouTube. So you need to be on YouTube. Whether it's an audio version or whatever you decide, whatever fits within your time and your financial budget, you need to find a way to get your podcast on YouTube. The next one in this list is next action step as part of YouTube's impact, driving new hits for the medium. From Theo Vaughn to the Kelsey brothers, they say, as noted before, we need these new stars to show up for podcasting. Let's make this literally part of the deal. I don't exactly know what they're talking about here. Do you know?
So what they're saying, well, the companion article that, once again, I recommend if you want something condensed and you want like the very high bullet points, they're saying that of the sample size of the folks that they interviewed, 56% of monthly podcast consumers are male, and they bring up that they had asked, I guess, people in this survey to name their 3 favorite podcasts this year. And there was a couple of new entrants that, outside of the typical Joe Rogan and, Call Her Daddy, things like that. Shannon Sharp's podcast, the Kelsey Twins podcast, and not twins, but the Kelsey's podcast, brothers, and Theo Vaughn are new entrants. So we're seeing new personalities and shows enter like these top 20 lists, and the immediate kind of recognition that is there. And it does make a good point here that it just they say something to the effect that this is not indicative of podcast being a male only thing or a male dominated medium. It's just that it just so happens that a lot of the new talent happen to be male. So there's that kind of connection there. So to answer your question.
Yeah, no, that's just, I wonder how much like Taylor Swift had an impact with the Kelsey brothers podcast in particular, because there was that time frame when, God, as an NFL fan,
has she ever been a guest? Probably not.
God, we'd never hear the end of it. But it's there was a moment, or it's starting to kick back up again for this football season. But last football season, it just felt like everybody was talking about Taylor Swift and, all of it. She really was responsible for, bringing in a sort of new set of fans to the NFL. Yeah. But as a side result to that, the Kelsey brothers, like their podcast shot up to the top 10 charts. And then it led to them getting like didn't they just get like a massive new deal too, for their show? And so you have to that YouTube point, You probably have a lot of people that are finding out about Travis Kelce. They're finding out about his podcast. They go to YouTube, they do a search for it, or they do a search in Google. And because Google owns YouTube, they're probably seeing the podcast pop up in YouTube, and they're going there and they're subscribing. And then if they like that content, then YouTube, their discoverability, their recommendation algorithm is very good. And so YouTube is going to be showing you relevant content, relevant shows to that. So that now makes a lot of sense, that if people are discovering those new shows like the Theo Vaughn and the Kelce brothers, then that is a situation where their popularity increases. There was the rising tide lifts all sails. So it's good for podcasting in general. So again, get on YouTube. All right, the next findings and action steps, it reads, while time constraints and life changes are always a factor in churn, waning interest is just as relevant. Sometimes those who lose interest don't just leave the show, but the medium itself. And so the action step for this is every podcaster reading this should devote a little bit of time to each episode to talk about what the podcast offers that nothing else can. So what do you take away from this one?
So I guess they're saying be a champion of the podcast medium. Like even, I guess, an advocate. That one's a little loose. You know who does a great job of advocating podcasts as an audio form is, I mean, they should be a sponsor at this point, but Buzzsprout. They always make a very good point of like the engagement, their kind of relationship between listeners and podcasts, and how it's a little more attentive, and that. So that's what I'm getting at is, I guess, as a podcaster, become an advocate or a preacher of podcasting. I don't know. That was a little funky. What's the other action?
Well, it says waning interest is just as relevant as far as like a stat point that you should be paying attention to. And so it's folks who, I guess, maybe being a more of a champion of listening to podcasts in general versus it kind of contradicts everything we just said about go to YouTube. So, I guess to each their own. I don't really know what that action step is trying to tell me. So let's skip and go to the next one. The next finding and action step is nearly half of the lapsed listeners don't know when they will listen to their next podcast. And so the action step is we need to instill a sense of urgency about the medium so that when a listener falls, quote unquote, they are caught by another podcast, not TikTok. That to me is so big company speak
for sure.
Going back to our first point, Wondery, NPR, keep the user inside the platform. Don't let them go to TikTok because I don't know, they got a little like magnifying or not magnifying, but they're trying to hypnotize you over on TikTok. There's no way to measure this, to attribute it, because there's so many variables. You just sometimes you get caught up. Exactly. Listening to a show, you got to stop. You got to take care of something, and how are you supposed to solve that? That's a dumb action step. Moving on to the next one.
Don't you leave this podcast. I swear to God.
Don't fall off. Is that what we're supposed to do? Sounds profitable?
That's going to be the dynamic content I insert in all my podcasts. You better still be listening. Are you listening?
Okay. One of the other ones was, while the perceptions and behaviors of existing podcast consumers were relatively static, the non-consumers changed in some dynamic and interesting ways. They might just be bored. So the action step is want to find a way to attract a new audience. Don't just tell them how great podcasts are. Ask them if they are tired of screens, mindless scrolling, and finding nothing new on TV. Shift the ground beneath them. This is such a corporate study.
This almost feels like I need to go door to door and say, have you heard about our Lord and Savior Apple Podcasts or podcasting in general? I mean, I get the spirit. I get the spirit that's like, look, if you're putting this much time and if you're serious about podcasting, you should also want the industry to thrive. And, our industry is in competition with so many other things that could detract attention or is garnering their attention, whether it be social media and news and TV and whatever apps, streaming, blah, blah, blah. So I see. But I feel like those last three action steps could all be rolled into one, which is being an advocate for podcasting and leaning in on the benefits, which I do think there are a lot of benefits to podcasting as a medium that other mediums don't necessarily have, like just the range of topics, the range of shows, the, kind of, I feel like I've always kind of go on this tangent about why podcasts are special. So I won't go into that whole diatribe, but that's what I feel with these last 3 action steps. But it feels a little culty when I hear you read those. I guess, do you get anything out of those?
No.
Okay.
I mean, there are
I just
some
watched the switch turn. You were pretty excited about this report. We were both kind of like, giving it its props. Now you're like, wait a minute.
We need more independent podcast studies. I don't know how you can really. Maybe Alex is really like the key in that regard. Alex Enfilbo from
We're gonna have
Pod
to get him
Pros.
on. I think he's gonna be our first guest. Yeah.
I don't really see any value of like independent podcasters can take from this. I mean, they do have some other stats about, people of color, LGBTQ plus,
I think that
women, they're listening more, but it's like,
I think
kind of no duh. Like,
yeah. Well,
podcast listeners isn't increasing, so all these demographics will definitely increase as well. I do think this is interesting. The non-listener. It comes from that same sample size, that little over 5,000 people. So they asked, when was the last time, if ever, you listened to a podcast? And 26% of people that were surveyed of that 5,000 have never listened to a podcast. So that's pretty significant of that group. And so when we're thinking about the rest of these stats, my math is going to be terrible. Is that 74% of 74% of this 5,000 group are the ones that are actually listening to a podcast. So 26% of that 5,000. So we're even talking about even a smaller sample size than what we thought. Some of the reasons that they list of not listening to a podcast is they seem settled with their choices, but opportunities abound. It's tempting to point to discovery as the cause of all friction in podcasting, but the real sticking point is inertia. Some of the reasons why folks haven't listened to a podcast, some of the top responses, my existing options give me what I need. The second one is I prefer watching video over listening. That sits at 27%. The ones that I just mentioned, my existing options give me what I need, is at 34%. I prefer reading over listening at 23%. I don't understand the benefits of podcasting, 22%. The next one, not enough free time, 17%.
That's fair.
So maybe that signals back to those little action steps and takeaways as the responsibility is on us, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. I haven't really formed that opinion. But they do highlight another one that I can't find a podcast that seems interesting, 13% of people on why they haven't listened to a podcast. But that's a little weird if you haven't listened to a podcast but you can't find one that seems interesting. Why haven't you listened to a podcast that my existing options give me what I need? I think is the biggest call out here,
which I think goes back to what I said. Like, we are always are competing with other ways of entertainment, like whether that be social media or anything else. Like, yeah, it's the attention economy. Like, there's only so much time in the day. Let's be real, podcasting, as intimate and as like personable as it can be, as I think it is, like it does, like you do have to commit some time to it. Now granted, you could do other things, but for some folks don't have that time to commit to it, whether it be passively listening or unpassively. And that's not, I don't know. I think this is a very, obviously, a case by case basis. I don't think you could change everyone's opinion or give more people time, but I just don't know if there's any action items for me there other than like championing or using things like Podroll to recommend other podcasts and maybe help listeners find shows that might be appealing to them.
So some of the other the breakdowns that I just thought were interesting as I'm scrolling through, but it says for each type of podcast, how likely would you be to listen? 53% of people say a favorite TV show or movie. 50% say a podcast produced by a favorite TV show or movie. Corporate. 47% of people say a podcast hosted by a favorite celebrity or creator from another medium. And then 43% say a podcast about a favorite brand or a product. And that's for how likely would you be to listen?
Which is, it's like, okay, I'm an indie podcast. I'm not getting Shannon Sharp or Theo Vaughn on the podcast. Right. And and I'm kind of maybe jumping the gun to our other topic about podcast length, but I don't know. Sometimes that seems like it's definitely catered towards, you look at their sponsor list and it's like, okay, ESPN podcast can get, some big names on there. And I just don't know what the major takeaways for an indie podcaster that we're trying to help would be in that, other than, the YouTube part. And maybe, and I think maybe having a good understanding of demographics is probably helpful to someone, maybe where their show is catered to a certain demographic, or a certain culture or background. I did find that interesting, that the demographic breakdown, just in case maybe you have a show that caters to a certain audience, and you can apply interviews or guests, or segments that appeal to them. Do you have any other major takeaways from this study that might be helpful to the viewers?
Well, I mean, I am looking at some of the top 20 favorite podcasts of these less than 5,000 now, because if we go back to what was said earlier, it was 5,071 total surveyed, and then 26% of those people have never listened to a show. So we're moving that 26.
They were just there for the free Amazon gift card.
Right. It's like free Amazon gift card or something that they were offered.
A few of those 26% probably have a favorite podcast, but they're like, you know what? I can get out of this survey right now and still get that gift card.
Well, I mean, that's another really good question. If we're, thinking critically about the study and how this data is presented, why should you be able to comment on your favorite podcast if you've never listened to a podcast? Very simple things. That should be an immediate disqualifier that, you don't get to continue the survey if you've never listened to a podcast.
No soup for you. No gift card for you. So who's on this top 20 list? Because
it was Joe Rogan by a mile, which I'm looking. He has 13% of these people listed as, in their top 20 of favorite podcasts. Crime Junkie and The Daily, New Heights, the Kelseys, are all at 2%. Everybody else on this list, so like Dateline, Call Her Daddy, Stuff You Should Know, This American Life, Club Shay Shay, Pod Save America, all Conan O'Brien, they're all sitting at 1%. And so if I do have one takeaway for the indie podcasters out there, get your ass on YouTube, because if these people, these high profile people, are only polling at 1% for favorite shows, I think that you have to be in as many places as possible. And unless you're doing it as a hobby and you don't really want to make a whole lot of money from it, because now podcasting has grown up in a way that the professionals are here, quote unquote professionals are here. And what I mean by that is the people with the big budgets, the people with the expensive studios, the expensive equipment that can get those high profile guests. You're really playing a different game when you are competing in the attention economy. And so you need to think about distribution for your show. You need to think about focus on where your audience is hanging out and focusing your efforts there, because you don't have the time and the budget to be everywhere and everything to everyone. Pick one social media platform to post distribution clips, talk about your episodes, build a community, get your podcast on YouTube. Otherwise, you don't stand a chance. That's as far as, building a hardcore listening audience. I mean, that's kind of what my takeaway from this is. We're doing a lot of the right things. I think we preach a lot of the right things to the audience, but, keep those numbers in perspective, especially when, Buzzsprout is, releasing those monthly, global stats for their listening audience. It's something like 30 plays if you get it on an episode within 7 days, that you're in the top 50% of all podcasts. Like, keep those stats in mind, because when you do start a show, it's going to be a slow grind, especially if some of these top podcasters in the game are only polling at 1%.
If I may also add something here for my indie podcasters out there, I hear that top 20 list and I hear your advice, and I think there's a little bit of freedom knowing that I probably realistically will never compete with that. I mean, I can't, right? I don't have the budget, I don't have the resources or connections. I think there is a sense of freedom in kind of accepting that and being realistic, and kind of knowing that, okay, I'm going to do what I can and what I want. And I think we've got a separate video about to video or not. I think at the end of the day, it came down to try and have some presence on YouTube. But I will reiterate that if you don't want to, if you're completely fine with it being your show being an audio only podcast, then go for it. Like, that is your prerogative, and I respect that. And I find a lot of freedom and newfound joy in the medium by just focusing on being there for my community and my listeners and building my audience. I'm not trying to get everyone to listen to the show. I think having a dedicated listenership that you cater to, that a niche within a niche, goes a long way. So I just don't want no one to like hear this and feel demoralized, because that is sometimes a feeling I get looking at these reports, where it feels a little like, well, that don't really apply to me. I don't, I can't compete with that, but I could look out for my listeners that have been looking out for me and hope that they can bring in folks, and I can cater to a certain demographic.
Yeah, I think that that's well said, because when you see stuff like this and you see all these bigger players coming into the mix, a lot of them have shows that they are tying to their podcasts.
Exactly.
And so we already talked about some of the best categories for that, and, creating, the immediacy to listen to it. So some of the different show like Game of Thrones or House of Dragon, like as soon as an episode ends, like what were our listening habits is we immediately open up YouTube, start the live stream of people talking, especially about that episode. And so think about ways that you can play into those listening habits and building your show into your audience's listening habits.
Yeah.
If that is one takeaway I could build or give to folks, is to figure out, obviously YouTube, but then to figure out how you can build your show into somebody else's habits. Because in this study too, they asked everyone, how many shows do you listen to a week? Only 20% of people listen to 5 different shows a week. The median is 3.5. That did grow from 3.2 last year. So this year it's 3.5. So it is slightly grown, but that's a little over 3 shows a week that average users from this study are listening to shows. And so keeping that in mind, how can you be one of those 3? Or how can you, start to be the 0.5 of those 3 and then build your way up? And so you got to play the attention economy game. And if you want to be serious about developing listenership and community, there's so much that goes into it. But then there's also, to your point, the beauty of simplicity, and that's making content that you genuinely enjoy. Because if you make content that you genuinely enjoy making, then it shows in your work. And slowly but surely, you will build up that listening audience for people that appreciate that same level of content. I think it's also slightly encouraging that, a lot of these big names, these big profiles, famous Hall of Fame athletes, like movie stars, all of those people to poll at 1% kind of tells me that maybe the independent medium is pulling the weight. Maybe one of those shows is going to be your Joe Rogan each week. But maybe you can be one of those other ones. And so maybe that's a little bit of a way to end it on a positive note.
That's a great way to end it. And I want to say, if you are a listener that has our show, the JPU show, as one of your 3.5 shows that you listen to every week, God bless you. We love you. And we're going to turn the table on you guys and ask, one, check out the report. All right. Like, obviously we've got our gripes with it, but for the most part, I think it's a fascinating read, especially the article. Let us know what you think about any of the things that we said, any of the action items that they shared. We'd love to get your opinion if you're a podcast or even a listener. Maybe you've got some interesting perspective from that point of view. Let us know in the comments in this YouTube comment section. And if you're listening to the audio only, extra God bless you, because I'm an audio guy first. So thank you for listening, and send us a text. You can text us directly using the link in the episode show notes in the podcast version. And that is what we got for you today. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. Keep on creating is our new tagline that we're going to use. Take care. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you around. All right. Peace.